The first thing Mason Archer noticed was the voice, not the person, just the voice. Soft, warm, untrained. In the casual way, people hum when they believe nobody is. Listening, it floated across the airport cafe like a ribbon of music. Mason had spent 15 years flying. Airplanes, through thunderstorms, turbulence, and red-eye exhaustion. Yet somehow that quiet melody made him pause harder than any rough landing ever had. Schubert, Mason blinked. Someone is humming Schubert in an airport coffee bar. The thought alone made him smile faintly. He had almost forgotten music like that existed outside concert halls. The morning rush buzzed around him. Rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, espresso machines screaming. But through the chaos, the melody remained gentle and steady. Mason leaned slightly against the counter, pretending to check his phone. Actually, he was listening. Who hummed Schubert at 6:40 in the morning? Curiosity tugged at him. Then he saw him. The singer stood near the pickup counter, holding a paper cup with both hands like it might escape. Dark curls fell loosely across his forehead. A charcoal coat hung over narrow shoulders. He looked nervous. Not shy, exactly. More like someone standing on the edge of something important. The humming stopped when the barista called his name. Federico. The man lifted his hand. Yes, yes. Thank you. The accent was unmistakably Italian. Mason felt something shift inside his chest. Federico thanked the barista again, then turned and immediately bumped shoulders with Mason. Coffee sloshed dangerously near the rim. I'm so sorry, Federico said quickly. Mason instinctively steadied the cup. Their hands brushed just a second. Warm fingers. Federico froze. Mason smiled automatically. The easy charm that had gotten him through thousands of passenger greetings. No harm done, Mason said. Federico let out a breath of relief. Grazie. Thank you. His English was smooth, but careful. Mason noticed something else. Federico kept glancing at him with mild curiosity, like he was trying to figure something out. Then, Federico tilted his head. You were listening. Mason raised an eyebrow. To what? Federico's lips curved slightly. The humming caught. Mason chuckled. Maybe. Federico's eyes brightened. You know Schubert? I dated someone in college who loved opera. Mason said. That wasn't entirely true. The truth was more complicated. Music had always been his quiet refuge, growing up in a house where certain topics were never discussed. Federico studied him for a moment. Then something playful appeared in his expression. Most Americans think Schubert is a chocolate brand. Mason laughed. Harsh. Shrugged lightly, but usually correct. There was a brief silence, the kind that isn't uncomfortable. Just curious. Federico finally extended his hand. Federico. Castellani. Mason Archer. Their handshake lingered. Half a second longer than necessary. Both noticed, both pretended not to. Federico shifted his coffee cup. You travel for work? Pilot. Federico's eyebrows rose. Ah, that explains the calm face stirring near coffee. Disasters. Mason smirked. Years of training. Federico looked impressed. Then he sighed softly. Wish there was training for today? Big day? Federico hesitated, then nodded. My first American concert? Tonight? Something in his voice carried nerves and excitement mixed together. Mason leaned casually against the counter. That explains the Schubert warm-up. Federico laughed quietly. You noticed that too? Hard not to. Federico studied Mason again, and suddenly his expression softened. You have a pilot's face? A pilot face. Yes. Federico gestured vaguely, confident, but also tired. Mason snorted. That's disturbingly accurate. Federico smiled. Then his eyes flicked briefly toward Mason's jawline before returning to his Coffee, Mason noticed, and strangely it made his chest tighten because he knew that look. He had seen it before, mostly from women. He had dated plenty nice dinners. Weekend trips, friendly breakups, all perfectly normal, all perfectly safe, but none of them had ever made his stomach flip the way a look from this stranger just did. Careful, Mason told himself. Federico cleared his throat. So, Pilot Mason Archer. Do you always eavesdrop on airport musicians? Only the talented ones. Federico laughed again. That laugh felt warm, genuine, unfiltered. Something about it made Mason relax. You are kind, Federico said. I'm honest. Federico tilted his head thoughtfully. Then suddenly, would you like to hear the rest? Mason blinked. Right now? Federico nodded toward the empty corner near the windows. No audience. Yet Mason hesitated. This is ridiculous, but also strangely appealing. He shrugged. All right. They moved to the corner. Federico set his coffee down, then closed his eyes and began to sing. Not loudly, just enough to fill the small space between them. The sound was breathtaking, rich, controlled, emotional in a way that made Mason's chest ache. Passengers walked by without noticing, but Mason stood frozen. Holy! The final note faded gently. Federico opened his eyes and immediately looked nervous again. Well? Mason exhaled slowly. You're going to destroy that concert tonight? Federico blinked, then laughed in disbelief. That's good. That's good. Federico studied Mason carefully, trying to decide if he was joking. When he realized Mason was serious, something shy flickered across his face. Thank you. Mason shrugged. You should warn people before doing that. Why? Because now my morning feels boring in comparison. Federico laughed again, then glanced at his watch. Oh no. What? I must go rehearse. Mason nodded. Duty called for both of them. Soon, Federico hesitated before picking up his coat. Then he said something. Unexpected, you should come tonight. Mason blinked. To the concert? Yes. Federico's voice was suddenly softer. I would like a familiar face in the audience. Mason felt his heartbeat shift. This was ridiculous. They had known each other for 12 minutes, yet something about Federico made the invitation feel important, almost personal. Mason reached into his pocket, pulled out a pen, then grabbed a napkin. He scribbled quickly. Federico watched with curiosity. Mason slid the napkin across the table. My number. Federico looked surprised. In case the concert destroys you, Mason said casually. Pilots are trained in emotional recovery. Federico grinned, very reassuring. There, fingers brushed again, when Federico took the napkin. This time neither moved away immediately, just a small pause, a quiet spark. Federico folded the napkin carefully, then tucked it into his coat pocket. I will text. You, Mason nodded. Federico stepped back, but before leaving, he said softly, Thank you for listening. Mason held his gaze. Thank you for singing. Federico turned toward the exit. Then, suddenly glanced back with a playful smile. Try not to crash any airplanes thinking about Schubert. Mason laughed. No promises. Federico disappeared into the terminal. Crowd, and for a long moment Mason simply stood there, staring at the empty space. What just happened? His phone buzzed in his hand. A new text. Unknown number. Federico. Pilot Mason. If you don't come tonight, I will assume Americans fear opera. Mason smiled slowly. Then, typed back, only the bad singers. 3 dots appeared. Immediately Federico. Then you must come. Mason looked toward the departure. Bored, his flight schedule, his carefully structured life, his predictable routine. And, for the first time in a long time, something inside him felt curious, dangerously curious. What if tonight changes something? Mason slipped the phone into his pocket and walked toward his gate, but the voice followed. Him warm, lingering, impossible. To ignore, for the first time in 35 years, Mason? Archer wondered if the life he had been flying through wasn't the life he actually wanted. Mason Archer had landed planes in thunderstorms. He had navigated emergency landings, patient passengers, and air traffic chaos. Yet somehow, standing outside the concert hall that evening made him strangely nervous. The building glowed warmly against the cold night air. Soft golden lights spilled through tall windows. People dressed in elegant coats moved toward the entrance. Opera crowd. Mason glanced down at himself. Dark jacket, clean shirt, respectable enough. Still, a quiet voice in his mind whispered, "What exactly are you doing here?" He knew the answer. Federico, or more specifically, the way Federico had looked at him that morning. Mason exhaled. Slowly, "Relax," he muttered to himself. Then, he stepped inside. The concert hall was already filling. Soft conversations echoed through the room while musicians tuned their instruments. Mason found his seat halfway back. Good view of the stage. His eyes scanned the velvet curtain. Somewhere back, there was a nervous Italian humming Schubert again. The thought made him smile. Lights dimmed slowly. The audience quieted. The orchestra entered first, then the conductor. Finally, Federico walked on stage, and Mason's breath caught. The nervous man from the coffee shop looked completely different under stage. Lights, confidence, elegant. His dark suit fit perfectly. And the soft curls, Mason remembered, were carefully styled, but still slightly rebellious. Federico bowed politely. Then his eyes lifted toward the audience, just briefly. But Mason could swear they met his. A flicker of recognition crossed Federico's face, almost invisible, but unmistakable. He came. Federico's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then the music began. When Federico started singing, the entire room changed. The voice Mason heard in the cafe had been beautiful, but this was something else. Powerful, emotional, alive. Each note carried something deeper than technique. It carried a feeling. Mason leaned forward slightly without realizing it. How does someone even do that? Federico's voice moved effortlessly between tenderness and strength. At one point, during a quieter passage, Federico's gaze drifted again across the audience and stopped, right on Mason just for a second. But Mason felt it like electricity. Federico held the note, and the corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. Then the moment was gone. But Mason's heart was suddenly beating much faster. The concert ended in thunderous applause. Federico bowed again and again. Clearly overwhelmed by the response, Mason found himself clapping harder than anyone. Around him, he earned every bit of this. Eventually, the crowd began to leave. Mason stood slowly. Part of him wondered if he should just go home. It had been a beautiful evening. Maybe that was enough. But then his phone buzzed. A message. Federico. His backstage door. 5 minutes. Mason smiled. Well, all right then. The backstage hallway smelled faintly of wood and stage makeup. Mason leaned casually against the wall near the door. Trying to look like he belonged there, footsteps approached quickly. Then the door opened. Federico stepped out, still wearing the stage suit, but the polished confidence from the stage had softened into something more human again. His hair was slightly messier now. His breathing is still a little quick from adrenaline. When he saw Mason, his entire face lit up. You came. Mason crossed his arms lightly. You doubted me? Federico smiled sheepishly, a little. Mason pretended to be offended. That hurts. Federico laughed. The sound echoed softly in the quiet hallway. Then he stepped closer. Did you like it? Mason raised an eyebrow. Be honest. Federico nodded. You're dangerously good. Frederico blinked, dangerously. Mason shrugged. Now I feel like I accidentally befriended a celebrity. Frederico laughed again, shaking his head. No celebrity. Tell that to the audience. Frederico leaned against the wall beside him. For a moment neither spoke, just standing close enough to feel each other's presence. Frederico finally said quietly, I saw you. Mason glanced at him. When? During the second area. Frederico's eyes were warm. I was very glad you were there. Something about the sincerity in his voice made Mason swallow. You did great, Mason said softly. Frederico studied him for a second, then suddenly nudged Mason's shoulder lightly. Admit it. What, you only came because you were curious about the mysterious opera singer? Mason smirked. Maybe. Frederico tilted his head. And now? Mason met his eyes. Now I'm curious about the man. Frederico froze for half a second. The air shifted. Not awkward. Just... Charged Frederico cleared his throat and looked down briefly. You were very direct for a pilot. Occupational hazard. Frederico chuckled, then glanced at Mason again. And what exactly are you curious about? Mason pretended to think. Well, for starters, he gestured toward Frederico's suit. How someone who looked terrified in an airport cafe becomes that on stage. Frederico smiled softly. Music is easier than life. That's a suspicious answer. Frederico shrugged. Maybe. Stage assistant walked past carrying equipment. Frederico stepped slightly closer too, Mason to make room close enough that their arms brushed. Neither moved away immediately. Frederico noticed. Mason's collar had folded slightly during the concert. Without thinking, he reached out and fixed it. Just a small adjustment. But the gesture felt strangely intimate. Frederico realized what he'd done. His hand paused. Mason looked down at it, then back at Frederico. Frederico's cheeks warmed. Sorry, Mason smiled softly. Don't apologize. Frederico pulled his hand back slowly, but the moment lingered, like a quiet spark. Neither wanted to disturb. Eventually, Frederico sighed. I must escape before someone asks me to sing again. Mason laughed. Lead the way. They stepped outside into the cool night air. City lights reflected off the wet pavement. Frederico breathed deeply. Much better. Mason shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. So what does a world-class opera singer do after conquering an American audience? Frederico glanced sideways at him. You are teasing, maybe. Frederico smiled thoughtfully, then said something unexpected. Walk with me? Wait. Mason nodded. They started down the quiet street. Their shoulders occasionally brushed as they walked. Neither seemed to mind. Frederico looked up at the night sky. When I was younger, I thought my life would feel clear by 30. Mason laughed softly. Let me know if that ever happens. Frederico looked at him curiously. You also feel unfinished. Mason hesitated, then shrugged. Sometimes. Frederico studied him, like he understood more than Mason had actually said. Then he smiled gently. Well, tonight felt like a beginning. Mason raised an eyebrow. Of what? Frederico looked forward again. Something interesting. Mason chuckled. You're mysterious. Frederico nudged his shoulder lightly again. You like mystery? Maybe I do. They walked another block. Then Frederico slowed slightly. You know something funny? What? Frederico glanced at him. This morning, I thought the most frightening part of my day would be singing for 1,000 strangers. And now, Frederico's eyes held his. Now I'm more nervous walking beside one pilot. Mason felt his chest tighten slightly. Why? Frederico smiled quietly. Because the pilot is harder to read. Mason considered that, then leaned slightly closer as they walked. Maybe the pilot is still figuring things out? Frederico's expression softened. Well, he bumped Mason's shoulder gently again. I am patient. Mason laughed. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt wide open. The night air had grown colder, but neither Mason nor Frederico seemed ready to end the walk. They had already passed 3 intersections without deciding where they were going. Not that either of them cared. The quiet city. street felt strangely private, like the world had stepped back to give them room. Federico tucked his hands into his coat pockets. You walk like a pilot. Mason glanced sideways. I'm afraid to ask what that means. Federico smiled. Confident steps. Like you always know where you're going. Mason laughed softly. That's the biggest illusion in aviation. Federico tilted his head. Mason shrugged. Pilots are just really good at pretending we're in control. Federico studied him for a moment, pretending. Mason looked down at the pavement. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Sometimes. Federico's voice softened. You say that like you understand pretending very well. Mason felt the comment settle somewhere deep. He let out a quiet breath. I do. For a moment neither spoke. Just the sound of their footsteps. Federico broke the silence first. When I was 19, he said slowly, my voice teacher told me something important. Mason glanced at him. What? Federico smiled faintly. He said, Federico, the audience does not fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with truth. Mason nodded thoughtfully. Sounds wise? Federico looked forward again. I have spent many years trying to remember that. And Federico sighed softly. Truth is much harder than music. Mason chuckled. I believe that? They reached a quiet park bench beneath a street lamp. Federico gestured toward it. Sit. Mason nodded. They sat down, not too close, but not far apart either. For a moment they simply watched people. Federico rubbed his hands together for warmth. Then he glanced at Mason. You never told me something? Why did you really come tonight? Mason raised an eyebrow. I told you. Federico shook his head. No, you gave the polite answer. Mason smirked slightly. And the impolite answer? Federico leaned back against the bench. I suspect the pilot is more interesting than he pretends. Mason laughed quietly. You're very confident for someone who was terrified this morning. Federico nudged Mason's shoulder gently. Deflection. Mason sighed. Fine. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The truth? Federico nodded. Mason stared at the pavement for a moment. Then said quietly, because when you sang, something felt different. Federico's expression softened. Mason continued slowly. Like hearing a language I used to know, but forgot how to speak. Federico watched him carefully. And you wanted to hear it again. Yeah, Federico smiled gently. I'm glad. A comfortable silence followed. Federico studied. Mason for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, You hide things too. Mason glanced at him. Federico's tone wasn't accusatory, just observant. I think everyone does, Mason replied. Federico shook his head slightly. No, some people hide entire lives. The words hung in the air. Mason felt his chest tighten. Federico looked at him, carefully not pushing, just waiting. Finally, Mason asked, Is that what you did? Federico laughed softly. Of course. He looked down at his hands. I grew up in a very traditional family. Opera family. Federico smiled. No, soccer family. Mason laughed. That explains a lot. Federico nudged him again. Be respectful. Italians take soccer very seriously. Noted. Federico's smile faded slightly as he continued. When I realized certain things about myself, it felt impossible. Mason stayed quiet. Federico spoke slowly. In my town, boys like me did not sing opera. And they definitely did not. He hesitated. Mason finished the sentence gently. Fall in love with other men. Federico nodded. A quiet moment passed. Then Federico looked up again. So I left. Mason studied him for music. Federico shrugged. For truth? Mason felt something shift inside his chest. And did you find it? Federico's eyes met his. I'm still looking. Same smiled faintly. Same Federico tilted his head curiously. You? Mason rubbed the back of his neck. Being a pilot makes it easy to avoid certain conversations. Federico smiled knowingly. With yourself? Exactly. Federico leaned closer slightly. Girlfriends? Mason chuckled. A few. Federico nodded slowly. Let me guess. What? They liked you very much, usually. But something was missing. Mason glanced at him. You're very perceptive. Federico grinned. It is my job to understand emotions. Opera spy. Federico laughed. Something like that. The tension between them had changed. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was understanding recognition. Two people who had both spent years pretending. Federico suddenly stood. Come where? Federico pointed toward a small cafe across the street. Hot chocolate? Mason laughed. That's very specific. Federico winked. Opera singers require sugar. The cafe was nearly empty. Warm light glowed from hanging lamps. They took a small table near the window. Federico ordered for both of them in confident Italian. When the drinks arrived, Mason raised his mug. Too terrifying honesty. Federico clinked his cup lightly against it. Two terrifying pilots. They both laughed. At one point, Federico reached for a napkin at the same time Mason did. Their hands brushed again. Federico froze slightly. Mason didn't pull away immediately. Neither did Federico. Their fingers rested against each other for just a moment longer than necessary. Federico looked up. Their eyes met. The air shifted. Federico cleared his throat and finally pulled his hand back. Sorry, Mason smiled softly. You apologize a lot. Federico shrugged sheepishly. Occupational hazard. They finished their drinks slowly. Conversation flowed easily now. Stories about travel, music, flying. Embarrassing. Childhood memories. Federico laughed often, and every time he did, Mason felt something warm spread through his chest. Eventually, they stepped outside again. The streets were quieter. Now Federico stopped walking suddenly. What? Federico looked at him thoughtfully. May I ask you something dangerous? Mason raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Federico stepped closer. Not dramatically, just one small step, but it made the space between them feel different. What would happen? Federico said softly, if the pilot stopped pretending. Mason's heart skipped. Federico's eyes held his, gentle, curious, hopeful. Mason swallowed. I don't know, Federico smiled slightly. Neither do I. Another step closer. Now they were standing very near, close enough to feel each other's warmth in the cold air. Federico's voice dropped almost to a whisper. But I think it might be interesting. Mason laughed nervously. You're very persuasive. Federico tilted his head. Am I? Mason nodded slowly. Federico's gaze dropped briefly to Mason's lips, then quickly returned to his eyes. The moment stretched, electric, quiet. Federico spoke softly, Mason. Mason leaned slightly closer, without realizing it. Yes, Federico hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, then he whispered, I would like to kiss you. Mason's breath caught. Federico immediately added quickly, but only if Mason closed the distance. Not quite touching, just close enough that their breaths mingled in the cool night air. Federico's eyes widened slightly. Their noses almost brushed. Time seemed to slow. Mason's voice was barely audible. I've been wondering the same thing, Federico. Hand lifted slightly, as if deciding whether to touch Mason's face. The tension between them was almost unbearable now. One more inch, one small movement, and then a car horn blared loudly down the street. Both of them jumped slightly. The spell broke. Federico laughed breathlessly. Timing. Mason rubbed the back of his neck, smiling. Yeah. They stepped back slightly. Still smiling, still very aware of what almost happened, Federico looked at him softly. Tomorrow? Mason raised an eyebrow. For what? Federico's eyes sparkled. To find out if the pilot is brave. Mason laughed quietly. All right. Federico extended his hand. Mason took it. Their fingers squeezed gently, and neither wanted to let go. Mason. Archer barely slept that night. Not because of turbulence, not because of work, but because of one almost kiss that had replayed in his mind every 10 minutes since midnight. Federico's voice. Federico's eyes. The way the space between them. It felt charged with something neither of them could ignore anymore. Mason stared at the ceiling of his hotel room. What exactly are you doing? For 35 years, Mason had built a life that worked. A career people admired, a personality everyone liked, a version of himself that never raised uncomfortable questions. But now one opera singer had managed to shake all of it in less than 2 days. Mason rubbed his face and sat up. "You're a pilot, not a teenager." Yet somehow, the nervous excitement in his chest felt exactly like something he hadn't experienced since he was 1. His phone buzzed. A message. "Frederico. Good morning, Pilot Mason." Mason smiled despite himself. He typed back. "Did the opera star survive his American debut?" 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "Frederico. Barely." Then another message. "Coffee." Mason chuckled quietly. "You're brave inviting the man who nearly kissed you?" Pause. Then Frederico replied, "Yes, that man." Mason stared at the screen for a moment. His heart was beating much faster than it should for a simple invitation. Finally, he typed, "Send the location." The cafe Frederico chose was small and quiet. Sunlight spilled through wide windows, turning the wooden tables golden. Frederico was already there. This time, he wasn't dressed like an opera singer, just a dark sweater and relaxed jeans. And yet somehow Mason still noticed him immediately. Frederico looked up. The moment he saw Mason walking toward the table, his face brightened. "You came." Mason pulled out the chair. "You seem surprised?" Frederico shrugged lightly. "Pilots are mysterious creatures." Mason smiled. "And opera singers aren't." Frederico laughed softly. They ordered coffee. For a moment, they simply sat there. Both clearly aware of the unfinished moment from the night before, Frederico finally leaned back in his chair. So, Mason echoed. Frederico tilted his head. "I believe we left something unresolved." Mason chuckled nervously. "You think?" Frederico smiled gently. "But before we fix that," he hesitated. His playful confidence softened. "Slightly, there is something I should tell you." Mason studied him. Frederico rarely seemed nervous, but now his fingers were fidgeting with the edge of the coffee cup. "My concerts." Frederico began quietly. "They are not the whole story." Mason waited. Frederico took a slow breath. "My father still does not know." "About?" Mason asked gently. Frederico nodded. "About me." The simplicity of the statement carried years of weight. Mason felt it immediately. Frederico continued quietly. "He believes I am simply focused on music." Guide. Mason leaned forward slightly in telling him. Frederico smiled faintly. "In my hometown, opera was already unusual." Paused. "Being honest about who I love? That feels impossible." Mason nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you think." Frederico looked at him carefully. "You never told anyone?" Mason shrugged. "Some friends suspected." "No one asked directly." Frederico tilted his head. "And that made it easier." "Exactly." Frederico studied him thoughtfully. "Until now." Mason laughed softly. "Yes, until now their coffees arrived." "But neither of them touched the cups." Frederico spoke quietly. "When I saw you in the audience last night." He smiled. "I felt brave." Mason raised an eyebrow. "I just sat there."
Frederico
Shook his head no. His voice softened. "You looked at me like I was not strange." Held his gaze. "You're not." Frederico smiled gently. "Thank you." After finishing their coffee, they stepped outside into the crisp morning air. Frederico glanced at Mason. "Walk again?" Mason nodded. "I'm noticing a pattern." Laughed. "It seems to work." They walked slowly down a quiet street. Eventually, Frederico stopped. Near a small riverside railing, the water reflected the bright morning sky. Frederico rested his elbows on the railing. Mason stood beside him, close but not touching. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Frederico said softly, "I think yesterday we both said many brave things." Mason nodded. "True." Frederico glanced at him, "but not the most important." 1. Mason felt his heart beat faster. And what's that? Frederico turned toward him fully. Now the sunlight caught in his dark curls. I like you. The words were simple, but the honesty in them made Mason's chest tighten. Frederico added quietly, and that is frightening. Mason smiled gently. Good frightening? Frederico laughed nervously. Yes. Mason looked down for a moment. Then he said something he had never said out loud. Before, I like you too. Frederico's eyes softened immediately, and that is also frightening. Mason chuckled a little. Frederico stepped closer. Their shoulders brushed. Why? Mason hesitated, then admitted quietly. Because liking you means I can't pretend anymore.
Act, Frederico.
Studied him. Then I reached out slowly. He straightened Mason slightly. Crooked collar again, just like the night before. But this time, his hand lingered. Mason. Mason looked up. Frederico's. The voice was soft. You don't have to pretend with me. The warmth in Frederico's eyes made something inside Mason finally settle. 30-5 years of carefully built walls suddenly felt unnecessary. Mason took a small step closer. Now they stood only inches apart. Frederico whispered, May I try again? Mason smiled. You don't need permission anymore. Frederico's breath caught slightly then. Slowly he leaned forward. Mason met him halfway. Their lips touched gently. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. Just warm, careful, real. Frederico. His hand rested lightly on Mason's shoulder. Mason's fingers curled softly against Frederico's sleeve. The world around them seemed to fade for a moment. When they finally pulled back, both of them were smiling. Frederico laughed quietly. Well? Mason raised an eyebrow. Frederico shook his head in amazement. That was worth the suspense. Mason laughed. Agreed. Frederico rested his forehead lightly against Mason's for a moment. You know something? What? I think the pilot is very brave. Smiled softly. I think the singer helped. Frederico nudged his shoulder playfully. Teamwork. Mason looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time in his life, the future didn't feel like something to avoid. It felt like something to choose. So, Mason said. Frederico raised an eyebrow. Yes. What does an opera singer do after conquering America? Frederico grinned. Spend more time with a pilot. Mason laughed. That sounds like a good plan. Frederico squeezed his hand gently, and neither of them let go because sometimes, after years of hiding, all it takes is one voice, one moment, and one brave choicito finally land exactly where your heart belongs.